welcome all of you. Our discussion today will consist of 3 parts. I will start by interviewing each of our guest speakers. And I will start with Ben, who will discuss about the legal consequences, and then Elizabeth will share with us her insights into the financial consequences, and lastly, Victor will talk about Chinese countermeasures in the short and the long term. And then we'll move on to the panel discussion, where we'll have a more in-depth discussion into some of the most important questions. And lastly, we will have a Q&A session with our audience today. And I do encourage our audience to send us questions anytime during this program. And if you can, please indicate your name and your affiliations. Now, I'd like to first start with Ben. Hello, Ben. How are you doing today?
Hi, Angela. It's good to see you.
Great. Now, let's begin with the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. Now, President Trump signed it into law in July, and it posts sanctions on individuals and institutions that have been involved in the development and implementation of the national security law. So could you first start by telling us, what is the scope of this act and how likely would it be enforced?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. For those that don't know, Angela and I have been friends for almost 17 years since Peking University, where we studied for LSATs together, and she did much better than I did, which is why she's had such an accomplished career. So I'm so glad to be here and so glad to be with the other distinguished panelists. So in July, President Trump signed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and on the same day signed an Executive Order 13936. And these two documents work in tandem, although so far he's relied on only the executive order. The sanctions on the 11 individuals, including Carrie Lam, were all done through the executive order and not the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. And that's for a couple of different reasons. First, it's because all presidents, and certainly President Trump included, zealously guard his foreign policy and national security powers. And so he did it through what he thought he already had the power to do so. He didn't think Congress needed to give him the ability to sanction either these individuals or any of the Hong Kong banks, which we can talk about in a second. So first, he wanted to keep that. Second, he wanted to keep the timing to himself. The Hong Kong Autonomy Act has a very strict timing procedure where you spend a number of days identifying foreign persons who are seen to have undermined the Joint Declaration or Hong Kong's basic law. And then after that, you identify which sanctions, and then ultimately the president can act. Under the executive order, the president has a lot more ability to control the timing and the individuals who are sanctioned. So both the Hong Kong Autonomy Act and the executive order gives the ability for the president to put both primary sanctions on individuals, which is what he did for these 11 individuals, and then also put secondary sanctions on banks and other institutions who may continue to do transactions with those individuals. And that's very important because of the how much the secondary sanctions scope can reach. You can see that the individuals you may not care about as much, but the secondary sanctions are regardless if there's a US nexus. And so there's a lot of banks that are very concerned about their continued to do business with these 11 individuals.
Right, I see. So some of the commentators says that the Hong Kong Autonomy Act was like an empty threat. And the main argument is that as long as these individuals or the targeted institutions, they don't have assets in the United States, then the act virtually will have no impact on them. Like, what do you think of these comments? Do you agree, or do you think that there's something missing here?
I think it depends on what you see the reason for these sanctions are. Certainly Carrie Lam and the 10 other people probably don't think that these are an empty threat because, well, Carrie Lam, I think she may have pulled some assets out of the United States and some others divested to be safe. The real danger is the United States implementing secondary sanctions on financial institutions when there is no US nexus. And so right now, a lot of banks are considering what that looks like. And the Hong Kong Autonomy Act and the executive order don't define what will be considered a significant transaction with those individuals or material support. So everyone needs to assess that. And in terms of an empty threat, it really depends on your perspective. You know, these sanctions are probably unlikely to achieve the policy goal of rolling back the national security law or changing any Chinese policies in Hong Kong. On the other hand, it definitely raises the temperature and lets Chinese decision makers know that the United States may respond with these sort of sanctions when China takes actions that the United States doesn't agree with. So it's sort of not necessarily an empty threat, but it certainly may not achieve the ultimate goal that they claim to do.
Right. Yeah. You already mentioned that the Trump administration announced in August that the U.S. government will penalize the U.S. financial institutions and banks that conduct business with those 11 Hong Kong and Chinese officials that have been involved in the development and implementation of the national security law. And then there's a lot of news recently saying that this is really bad news for the banks in Hong Kong. And I know that those banks will lose business with those 11 individuals, but like, is that a really big deal, or do you think these sanctions has implications far beyond that?
I think the banks do think it's a big deal, and from what I understand, and from the clients that I've been advising, they're taking it very seriously. Being cut off, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act works where there's a menu of sanctions, and working from minimal to maximal. But to have a bank be placed as an SDN, a specially designated national, the way that Carrie Lam did, and be completely cut off from the US dollar transactions, and that would be a huge problem for banks. And so they need to take these sanctions on individuals seriously. So I think that right now, if it's just these 11 persons, they can cut them off. But of course, that list may be expanded. The president may add additional persons or entities in Hong Kong or China, as he's done in other policy contexts. And and they need to figure out if they can continue to do non-dollar transactions with these sorts of individuals, because if they were to face the consequences under these sanctions, then they would have a lot of problems.
Right. So are you saying that the banks are mostly concerned once the list is further expanded? I mean that as far as I know, every major bank will have like a very refined compliance program where the lawyers will closely scrutinize, they will closely monitor who will be the next person or next entity that might be on the list. So in theory, the banks can easily avoid this sanction as long as I don't do business with these individuals or entities. So what are the risks that banks are really concerned about? I mean, in what circumstances would they violate these sanctions?
I think you're right. I think a lot of big banks have good compliance programs and they're used to these things. But in this region of the world, they may be comfortable avoiding transactions with North Korea, but not as familiar as dealing with these list-based sanctions. So they need to get comfortable with identifying both the 11 persons on this list, but then as the list expands, identifying those persons, and then any entities that those persons may own, which are called shadow SDN. So if Carrie Lam owns a company, then that company is also not able to do dollar-based transactions, and banks need to be very cautious. And that's one way in which banks get into a lot of trouble. On the other hand, you need to have a risk-based sanctions approach, and you need to be able to understand how to both still do your businesses. And so what I counsel is to, especially right now, is to don't be the cautionary tale, to make sure that you are the one who are putting in these sanctions compliance in place, avoiding transactions with these 11 individuals, because it's such a volatile situation. 6 weeks ago, these sanctions didn't exist. We know that the U.S.-China relationship is fraught right now. We don't know what will happen in the next 6 weeks. So, you need to be very careful and make sure that you're avoiding significant transactions with these individuals, but also understanding that we don't know what the future will look like. And so, don't take any extreme measures that might alienate other customers.
Right, I see. Now, as both of us are lawyers, and we know, although a law may look very tough on paper, when it comes to enforcement, it might be actually quite weak. So based on your previous experience dealing in this area, how effectively does the US government monitor the compliance and enforce those compliance? Like adding to that, like, for instance, how does the US government obtain this kind of evidence of violations? Because, unless the bank, volunteer to turn over the confidential information of client to the US government, it seems quite difficult for the US government to figure it out. And also, if the bank do that, and wouldn't that amount to a violation of the client confidentiality obligations?
Well, yes and no. Hoping that the United States government doesn't find out is not a sanctions compliance policy. And every year and really every month, the United States takes significant actions against companies and individuals around the world, from multi-million-dollar fines to even criminal prosecution. And so the United States has quite a bit of ways to gather evidence for these transactions. But there's and so you don't want to assume that the United States won't find out if there are these transactions. On the other hand, the United States also encourages self-reporting in these situations. And so they understand that if you are making 1 million trades a day or a year, that you may have some problems, and you're much better off going to the government and saying, hey, we did these transactions that were prohibited under various sanctions policies. And last year, the Department of Justice issued a ruling that said that if you come forward voluntarily, your fines are automatically reduced by at least 50%, and sometimes a lot more, and you're a lot less likely to face more serious problems, such as being placed on SDN lists. There's a U.S. story where, two people are being chased by a bear, and the rule is you don't need to outrun the bear, you need to outrun the other person. And so if you're running a sanctions compliance program, you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can so that you're outrunning the other person, and that you're putting in risk-based sanctions compliance programs so that you're not the one who ultimately is caught by enforcers in Washington and elsewhere in the world.
Right, right. And what about the client confidentiality obligations?
Well,
if they turn it over.
It depends a lot on the jurisdiction, but in a lot of situations, if a government subpoenas records, that is an exception to client privilege documents. There's also ways for the United States to find out about transactions that does not violate confidentiality for banks and others. And I know Liz has a lot of experience based on her background and can talk more about that. But you can't assume that because you have a confidential relationship with the bank that regulators in Washington won't find out about illicit transactions.
I see. Okay, that's very, very helpful. Thank you very much, Bang. So now let's move on to the discussion about the potential financial consequences. And I'm very glad to have Elizabeth, who joined us from Washington, D.C. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm very good. It's rather late at yours end. Thank you very much for coming.
I'm pleased to join you.
So far, there's a lot of uncertainty regarding to how the United States will apply sanctions in the case of Hong Kong. And given your vast experience in this area, I wonder whether you can share with us, your experience before in terms of how the U.S. has applied sanctions to other countries. Do you see if there's any patterns in terms of the enforcement, and what can we learn from the past experiences?
Sure, it's a good question. And it's certainly very common to have lots of questions, there being a lot of uncertainty about a new program, a new sanctions program. It's a new authority. It's only weeks old, if you will, in terms of a couple of months here, but like in terms of the implementation, as well as the pieces of informal, if you will, guidance that are being issued in the form of statements from Secretary Pompeo or from others in the United States government. And right now, the community of compliance officials and policy watchers are all trying to figure out what the posture will be of the United States in terms of implementation and enforcement. So just what you're getting at in your question. There are some things we can learn from looking at the history of other sanctions programs, but one of the first most important takeaways is that this is different. It's extraordinarily different from the history, the arc of history of sanctions programs, and there are a couple of main reasons why. First is that China generally, Hong Kong specifically here, we're talking about major economies, a major financial center. We're also talking about, if we are thinking about China, the major strategic rival of the United States, strategic competitor of the United States. That is a very, those are high stakes for a sanctions program. And in many of the sanctions programs we're most familiar with from the last decades, for example, these are countries where their economies are much smaller. They are sort of exceptional states that have been shunned by many others in the international community. So the United States is out alone in imposing these sanctions and in taking these positions. So that's quite different now. There are some similarities here, which people are grasping for to try and understand if there will be a significance here, a replication of pattern. There are other sanctions programs that have called for, as in the underlying legislation, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act legislation, a report, a list of names. And so there's one of the reasons that Congress does that when putting together a piece of legislation is because for various reasons, it's not optimal for them to list specific entities that they want designated. You don't want to do that in statute. You want to direct the administration to put together this list, the implication then being that it will inform a sanctions process. And so at times, I'm thinking of the Russia context, for example, if some of your listeners watched the so-called oligarch list be put together under previous legislation a couple of years ago, that was an exercise, a list-making exercise, which had a relationship to sanctions that came subsequently. But now as we're watching this list, and as you were talking about with Ben, people are really wondering, and by the way, we don't have a list yet. You know, the designations that have been imposed are not the list of individuals nor of the financial institutions. And so we're wondering, will that list be, in fact, the same as the sanctioned individuals? Will it be expanded? And will there be a kind of sifting amongst financial institutions to shed business with those individuals, as you were just discussing, so that they will themselves stay off a list of financial institutions, the implication being that they might then avoid being sanctioned by the United States because it's such a significant development to impose sanctions on those major Hong Kong banks. So it's quite different in those respects, even while the underlying legal authorities that have put in place these sanctions and some features such as a menu of sanctions or a list requirement, those may be stylistically similar.
Right. So you are saying that maybe because of the very close economic ties between the United States and China, and there's a huge amount of economic states involved, that the United States will probably do things differently this time. Is that?
In this instance, yes. And that's something we also saw happen in 2014, for example, when the United States contemplated and then imposed, along with European partners, sanctions on Russia, a much more sizable economy than many of the others that have been targeted by US sanctions previously. So if you're thinking about Iran, North Korea, Syria, Cuba, the list is long, of countries or regimes that the United States has targeted with sanctions, Russia was much bigger. China is vastly bigger. So yes, that certainly has an important influencing and shaping effect on the way that the United States will proceed with sanctions in this domain.
Right, I see. And you know, in this city, before the promulgation of the national security law, there was a lot of anxiety among banks that, you know, the United States might cut off Chinese banks access to the entire dollar network. And although this nuclear weapon hasn't been used, still a lot of people are speculating that there is still remain a big risk, like a major bank might be specifically targeted in a future sanction under the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. So I was wondering, I know it's very hard to speculate, but can we speculate a little bit? What do you see is the likelihood that the US government will impose sanctions on a major Chinese bank? And if that occur, what do you foresee what the sanctions might look like?
Yeah, there's a couple of really important lessons to look to in the history of sanctions that help answer this question to the best of our abilities right now. And it's true that there's a lot of uncertainty. First, let's remember that this is not the first time that people have been worried about sanctions designating a Chinese bank, even a major Chinese bank. That's a little different than a Hong Kong bank, though it could be related. And earlier in this current administration, when the Trump administration was very focused on the maximum pressure strategy on North Korea, and there was a contemplation of major sanctions against those Chinese conduits for North Korean proliferation activity, that could have meant, or similarly, Iranian activity, that could have meant going after a major Chinese financial institution. So there is a little bit of prior thinking about this, but the other lesson the other historical experience and lesson we should look to is the time when the sanctions community or the financial services industry was aware that sanctions could be coming towards Russia and considered that they might come down hard on a major Russian financial institution, and watched the way in which the sanctions were imposed. And by and large, what the sanctions did not do was put on the SDN list, the kind of nuclear option you're talking about, an entire major systemically significant financial institution. And instead what they did was go after or create restrictions around certain financial products or kinds of activities, including creating restrictions in capital market activity and in securities activity. And it didn't prohibit US or European financial institutions in dealing with, or others in dealing with, the entirety of many of these Russian banks. That's a really important example that I think we should import here. So we can't say never. This administration is a big fan of very bold, disruptive, possibly not fully considered sanctions implementation. Excuse me, but I do think it's more likely that if there was a Hong Kong bank hit with these sanctions, that it would look more like the Russia case, where we're thinking about kind of financial activity or asset class instead of the entirety, that nuclear option. It would be an enormous escalation to go right there.
Right, I see. So I remember when the Trump administration reintroduced the sanctions on Iran back in 2018, it generated a lot of controversy, even among its allies. And it actually prompted its allies like France, Germany, and the UK to create an instrument in support of trade exchanges, basically to use euros to bypass the US sanctions on Iran. Now, do you see, now if the US impose sanctions on Hong Kong, do you see other countries' interests might be affected here? And how will you foresee those countries might respond?
Right. Well, one interesting thing about the INSTEX mechanism is that I'm not sure we should call it a success in managing as a non-bank financial facility to bypass sanctions. And in fact, what we might best observe about that is that those countries and the companies in those countries that might have reason to want to avail themselves of an alternative way to try and get around sanctions have in fact not been willing to violate US sanctions. So as we're thinking about all of these companies or banks in Hong Kong, which are contemplating a reality where they're wondering when would they want to step out of compliance with US sanctions, is there an instance when they might want to do that? How would they handle that scenario? I think actually, if they value their dollar activity and their dollar clearing, and they value the opportunity to do business with US persons, which I think across the board describes Hong Kong financial institutions, then they understand the significance of staying in line with US sanctions. So there may be other interests at play here where mainland Chinese financial institutions or companies may seek to try and insulate themselves from exposure, which is sort of thematically similar to what the Europeans were doing in setting up the Instex mechanism. And there's probably enough capacity or liquidity and sort of a business ecosystem that such that they could in fact, avoid the use of the dollar and avoid too much connectivity with US persons to trip US sanctions, or they could exist even when US sanctions were imposed. There's a few examples of that historically, as in the Iran case, where Chinese financial institutions have survived even under US sanctions. But there is a real ceiling on the growth and financial opportunity to those financial institutions if they want to go that road, down that road. I think that would apply here too.
Right, I see. So last question for you. So I know the US election is very close. Now, if Joe Biden wins the election now, a lot of people have speculated that. So do you think this would change the way in terms of how the US administration will impose sanction laws?
Sanctions in general, sanctions on Hong Kong.
Yeah, I mean, definitely about Hong Kong, yeah.
Well, let me reframe it this way and say, I think it's a very worthy question to ask. And most people in the United States in the, if you will, sort of China watching community who are, or the sanctions community broadly, but who are thinking about where this sanctions regime goes, I think they're contemplating this in the broader arc of the various sanctions and other economic authorities that the United States has used to target China. So this definitely also includes export controls, which have been have received an awful lot of attention, a source of much activity, recent development from the Trump administration. And the question is then, how would a Biden administration and frankly, how would the next US Congress, remember Congress gave us this Hong Kong Autonomy Act, right? As well as a prior Hong Kong piece of legislation last year and the Uyghur legislation too, creating another opportunity for US action, US sanctions action. So we should ask how that entire group of policymakers will consider policy activity in this area. And I would say, and I'd be interested to hear Victor and Ben's position on this too, but there's a lot of hawkish sentiment in the United States that is bipartisan. There's a lot of ongoing interest in continuing to drive hard with the use of these sanctions and export controls to try and defend US interests and push back against activities promulgated by, from Beijing or else in Hong Kong that is of concern. So I think, if you will, these policies have legs even after Trump is president, whenever that may be.
Right, so there might be path dependency here. We might observe that.
Yes, to be awfully academic about it, yes, it's possible.
So thank you, Liz. So let's now move on to discuss the potential countermeasures that China could use to retaliate against the US sanctions and China's recent strategy of de-dollarization. And we're pleased to have Victor here, who will join us. Hi, Victor. How are you doing?
Hi, how do you do, Angela? Thanks for having me.
Thanks. So I know you joined us from LA. It's late afternoon for you, yes?
Yep.
Yeah, so far the scope for the US sanctions on Hong Kong remains very limited. Now, but if, like Liz and Ben was talking about, there is a good chance that the sanctions might be further escalated. Now, how do you foresee, like for instance, if a major Chinese bank is targeted in the sanctions, how do you foresee China will return the fires? What do you think are the cards on China's table?
So this is a very interesting question, of course. So in terms of, retaliation against sort of partial measures by the U.S., we are already seeing this already. There's some kind of Chinese entity list, which includes Marco Rubio and that kind of stuff. But I would say that, of course, Chinese elites families, especially, are much more likely to have assets in the U.S. than the other way around. Although, we know there are some exceptions like Obama's brother and so on and so forth. So that's not really going to have any meaningful impact. It's purely sort of a propaganda move by China. The PBOC also can discriminate against U.S. banks and funds that are trying to set up shops in China. But right now, the PBOC is really trying to attract a lot more foreign portfolio inflows into China. So it has not done that yet, right? So it would rather take the money from U.S. investors, who of course are very enthusiastic about the Chinese equity market right now because it's performing very well. So far we haven't seen anything. The Chinese government can at some point decide to sort of kick out all the U.S. banks and funds, but because right now China is still such a small part of their business, it's not going to have any meaningful impact either. So now, what about the nuclear option that you and Elizabeth talked about? What if the U.S. were to impose sanctions on all Chinese financial institutions, so that they cannot use the dollar-based payment system? That indeed is a nuclear option. And the problem there is that actually Chinese financial institutions, especially if you include the Hong Kong-based ones like BOCHK, collectively owe the rest of the world somewhere between $1.5 to $2 trillion. And so if they're not able to use the payment system to service their debt, then immediately they're defaulting on the rest of the world. And, obviously financial institutions around the world, especially those in Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the UK, and France, these are some of the largest lenders to Chinese banks, are immediately going to have a lot of non-performing assets on their hands. And I would say a year ago, I would have told you that would be a complete disaster that the world cannot accept, and therefore the US cannot possibly do such a thing. But in the post-COVID world, what we've seen is the Federal Reserve printing $3 trillion in the space of 3 months, right? This is what we've seen between March and June. And the dollar remains nearly as strong as it was before. So the dollar fell by 10 cents to the euro at a time when the Federal Reserve print $3 trillion. So really, if the US were to impose sanctions, China were to default on all these banks around the world, one option is for the Federal Reserve and the ECB to work together to backstop the non-performing financial debt of all these Chinese financial institutions just by printing money, right? So if the ECB and the Fed were to print, 500 billion each to bail out all the European banks, all the Japanese banks, all the Korean banks, it would virtually have no impact on relative exchange rate, would have no impact on the entire banking system, but China would be sort of cut off from the rest of the world. So I think this nuclear option, I would say in today's world, it's a bit less unimaginable than it was a year ago.
Right, that sounds pretty scary. Okay, we've been talking about.
Not scary because everyone's printing money, so it's just printing press. Not scary.
Well, we've been talking a lot about Russia in this program because Russia is the country that has been hit multiple times by the U.S. sanctions. And as a result of that, Russia has started quite an aggressive program to de-dollarize. And since 2013, the Russian central bank has cut the share of the U.S. dollar in its foreign exchange reserve from 40% to 24%. And since 2018, the banks holding American Treasury debt has plummeted from over $100 billion to near $10 billion. And Russian debt is also being de-dollarized. Now, do you see China replicate any of these measures? Do you think that they might be feasible?
So there are a lot of fund managers in this country and in Europe which are praying that China would do that, would sell all of its holding of US treasuries, because what that will do is it will temporarily lift the yields of US Treasury debt, which is currently basically zero yield. Even 10-year treasuries yielding 0.5% or something like that. if China were to sell, 800-900 billion of it, in the space of a month or something like that, which would be very quick pace of selling. I mean, first of all, the Federal Reserve will step in immediately and buy it all up. But in the worst case, let's say the Fed doesn't do anything, Treasury yield would go up to 1%, 1.5%, which then all the fund managers from around the world will immediately buy it all up. They will be very happy. Their clients will be very happy. I will be very happy because I also would love to see this trade because right now, investing in the stock market is a bit too unsafe for me. Would much rather buy high yield treasuries if they were available. So I think, something like $1 trillion, which is roughly what China holds, would have almost no impact on the treasury market. Again, I think the bigger impact is on the liability side. China owes the rest of the world so much money that if it were cut off from continual financing, it can default on the rest of the world, and that would have a much greater impact on the financial system of the rest of the world.
Right, I see. Okay. So Wang Yongli, you probably have heard of the former vice president of the Bank of China. He recently stated that, China must calmly respond to these U.S. sanctions, because if the U.S. took extreme measure, like hit the nuclear button, then it will prompt other countries like China to create its own, international payment and settlement system. How likely do you see China and her strategic alliance be able to set up this alternative system to replace the US-centric one?
So I think certainly some countries find that very attractive. The US has imposed sanctions on officials in a number of different countries, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and now some Chinese officials. The problem with these countries that really would like to see an alternative payment system besides the one dominated by the US is that economically they're all very weak, except for China, of course. China is the second largest economy in the world. So, I took the liberty of looking at the GDP of a handful of close allies of China, like Russia, Cambodia, Venezuela, Laos, Iran, North Korea, Ethiopia, and Pakistan. If you add the GDP of all of those countries together, it's roughly $2.5 trillion. That's less than the GDP of the United Kingdom alone. So, and basically payment is driven by the GDP of these countries, right? So, if you're a poor country, you're not going to have a lot of payments because 冇錢, right? As we say in Cantonese, no money, right? So China, if China was able to convince Western European countries, Japan, Korea, and the Middle East to adopt its payment system somehow, then I would say the renminbi payment system would become a viable alternative. But until that happens, I think the scale of the payment will just be so small that even if China had its own payment system, it would be pretty minor in the grand scope of things.
Right. So in fact, China has started to trying to reduce its reliance on the dollar, even back in 2008. Since the 2008 financial recession, we saw China has tried to increase the use of yuan during the cross-border transactions, and particularly during the Belt and Road initiatives. And there have been a lot of reports recently about China creating forging a financial alliance with Russia, and so Russia would accept more, renminbi during the bilateral trade payments. Now, do you see this initiative achieve much progress? Has it helped to speed up the internationalization of the yuan? Are there any challenges, and are there any looming concern there?
Yeah, so I've been talking to people in the PBOC and bankers in China off and on this issue for the past 10 years basically, and the problem is that compared to say 8 years ago, the amount of renminbi that is available outside of mainland China is less today than 8 years ago. So it used to be over 1 trillion renminbi deposited in Hong Kong banks. Today is 600 billion renminbi. And the reason for that is because, every time that China wants more renminbi to circulate outside of mainland China, It offered different countries swaps. It tried to, have these trade clearance done in renminbi. The people holding these renminbi want to sell the renminbi and exchange it for dollars. And that creates downward pressure on the renminbi, which then the PBOC has to come in and spend very valuable dollar reserves that it holds to defend the value of the renminbi. So if China had a free floating exchange rate, which by the way, I think right now it's a perfect time for China to go toward that system of a free floating exchange rate, but it's, choosing not to do it. It's still relative peg. So every time that the renminbi offshore, the CNH, comes under pressure, the PBOC has to withdraw renminbi liquidity from Hong Kong so as to increase renminbi interest rates and thereby automatically defending the renminbi in Hong Kong. So actually it has had to shrink the amount of renminbi outside of mainland China multiple times in order to defend the renminbi, and that's why the renminbi is not circulating outside of mainland China.
Right, I see. So the internationalization of the yuan hasn't seemed to achieve as much progress as we have expected. But what about the digital currency? As we read in the news lately, that the People's Bank of China has expanded just in August the use of the digital yuan in several major Chinese cities. Now, is cryptocurrency the way to go that might allow China to challenge the US dominance, the dollar's dominance? And also I have seen reports and some proposals from other countries that are advocating for like a global digital currency containing a basket of central bank currencies. So how likely is this going to happen?
So the digital currency has the same problem as, renminbi right now as it is traded offshore. I mean, it's not like people are carting, buckets of renminbi cash around Hong Kong. I mean, it's all done digitally already right now offshore. Bank of China Hong Kong can wire, billions of renminbi to HSBC with the press of the button. I think, by switching over to the new PBOC digital currency system, it gives more data to the PBOC. I think certainly that has that advantage, but it doesn't solve the problem that some people holding renminbi offshore will want to sell those renminbi and exchange it for the dollar. Unless the PBOC can say, if you hold renminbi offshore, you can't sell it. But it's like, if I knew that I can't sell something, why would I buy it in the first place, right? So it runs into this dilemma. There is a way that, you can say that, okay, if you hold this digital renminbi, you can't sell it to a portfolio of investors. You can use it to buy stuff in China and only use it to buy stuff in China, or to use it to buy stuff from other vendors who will take the renminbi, digital renminbi. But then again, it's like, why would people accept something like that with so many limitations when they can just use dollars where there's no limitation? They can hide it in an offshore bank account or whatever. So that's the issue that's confronted by the PBOC. Within China, it's not a problem, right? So within China, the PBOC can just enact a law by fiat and say, everybody, you have to stop using Ant Finance, you have to stop using Alipay and use our payment system and use our cryptocurrency. They can do that because it's the Chinese government, but outside of China, this becomes a bit more difficult.
Right, I see. Okay, thank you, Victor. This is really helpful. Now let's move on to the panel discussion where we have the whole panel to delve more deeply into some of the issues that we just discussed. And at this point, I would like to remind the audience, I already received 14 questions, and I would like to remind the audience to send us any question that you might have, and do indicate your name and affiliation if possible. Now, so my first question for the whole panel, although not necessarily all of you need to respond, is that like the Hong Kong Autonomy Act requires the Secretary of State to come up with a list of foreign individuals by October. And the Secretary of Treasury will also submit the list of the foreign financial institutions who have significant transactions with those particular individuals. Now, in light of this, do you see more sanctions coming, especially before the US election?
I can start. It's a good question. The way I'm thinking about this is that I think it's quite likely that the United States will impose more sanctions, or rather I should say, will take more actions related to China before the election. However, I don't think there's a certainty that they will be under an authority for and related to Hong Kong specifically. I actually think it's much more likely that they will be related to the various U.S. concerns linked to Chinese IT, the Clean Network Initiative that the State Department has been so heavily promoting, IT and telecoms. I think it's more likely that the United States will use more of its export control authorities as a primary means rather than sanctions. I wouldn't put it past this administration to throw Huawei on the SDN list before it goes out, and it'll certainly be of interest to Trump and his reelection campaign to make sure that he is demonstrating himself to be really tough on China. And one of the ways that he has favored doing that in the past is by using these specific economic authorities. So yes, toward China more broadly, it's not a certainty toward Hong Kong specifically.
To echo what Liz just said, I totally agree that more fireworks between the U.S.-China relationship are almost guaranteed between now and November. What they are, what they look like, I think will be product of Chinese actions in response to Trump administration actions, internal discussions within the Trump administration. There is a fierce debate between those who are advocating immediate and intense actions against China and those that see those actions as detrimental to the economic recovery in the United States. And then there is the political ramifications of a fierce election cycle where I think President Trump sees being hard on China as a winning issue against Vice President Biden. And so he will continue to harp on China because every time he takes an action, he can win an election cycle and distract from some of the attention on the COVID response and domestic issues within the United States. So I agree that, there was a question in the audience that whether or not Hong Kong is particularly important or whether or not it is a piece in the U.S.-China strategy. And I would say that very much part of the overall U.S.-China strategy, and Hong Kong is one part of that, but not necessarily a focus for this president or this administration.
Right, very good. So I already saw a question from the audience. Actually, this is also a question I want to pose for the panel. It's about the dilemma the banks face. It seems like the banks are kind of sandwiched in between because they are worried that if I comply with the U.S. sanction law, that might amount to a violation of the Hong Kong national security law. And even if putting the national security law aside, banks are worried about potential external pressure that they might face from the Chinese government. And one example is the HSBC. We have seen the bank has been subject to a lot of negative media coverage in recent weeks. These reports were saying that HSBC was turned over some of the important evidence to the U.S. Department of Justice. Allegedly, those evidence indicated some dealings between Huawei and Iran, although we never know, until things have been confirmed. And then because of these negative coverage in the media, we saw HSBC's stocks has plummeted very sharply as a result. So what can banks do in this kind of, catch-22 dilemma?
I can start. There's a certain amount of symmetry in U.S.-China relations all the time. I think, you see the United States lists 11 individuals and China responds for 11 individuals. And there's a certain amount of symmetry when it comes to the Hong Kong Autonomy Act and the National Security Law in terms of some of its ambiguous provisions, where both laws and the executive order give the president and give the various governments a lot of discretion in how to enforce it. And so a lot of people look at the provision of the national security law, and my colleagues who are Hong Kong qualified are much more sophisticated in that analysis than I am, and they see that there is the ability to interpret it one way. But conflicts of laws is very common, particularly when it comes to sanctions and other areas. And usually regulators give banks and other companies the space to comply with both sets of laws or have discretionary enforcement. And I think there's still a lot of hope that that Hong Kong will take that perspective. On the other hand, they now have the ability, just like the United States does, to have a maximalist approach to enforcement. And if that's the case, then it will force banks and other institutions to pick between complying with Chinese and Hong Kong laws or complying with US sanctions enforcement. And if that's the case, it's going to put compliance departments in major banks in a very awkward position and have to navigate a very tight tightrope.
I think there's one just quick comment here. One good thing about the Chinese banking industry is that there are a large number of smaller banks in China. So worst comes to worst, you can have the larger banks handing off some of these sanctioned clients to the smaller banks without a lot of international exposure. They can still get VIP treatment. They can still have access to a wide range of wealth management options. And it would, have very little impact on them, except for their ability to hold assets in the U.S., of course.
Right. Okay. Now, many experts, and particularly from the academic side, have said that, if the United States continue to apply very aggressive sanctions on other countries to advance its foreign policy, then the U.S. dollars might eventually lose its dominance. But on the other hand, the financial analysts were saying that, look, the Trump administration has imposed very aggressive sanctions on Iran, and other countries, but yet we haven't seen the dollar has been weakened. And as Victor has just mentioned, and actually, even though the Fed has printed a lot of money, I mean, the dollars, still remain very strong. So, and this is also a question from our audience as well. So do you really see the U.S. current strategy of leveraging its dollar to advance foreign policy? Is it really a self-defeating strategy? And this is a question I want to pose to all of you here.
I can start with this one. And some analysts are very, as you say, they're very fond of making the argument that, if you will, overuse or ineffective use or ill-conceived use will sabotage the whole enterprise. And I have to say that people have been ringing that bell for a couple of decades, and it hasn't happened yet. So, and as Victor was pointing out, if you will, sanctions are stronger now than they were a couple of years ago. There was also a big bounce after, the last financial crisis where the dollar looked particularly strong. And the United States subsequently to that had an awful lot more opportunity to use that leverage in the form of sanctions internationally. The campaign of major sanctions against Iran, which of course caused countries all around the world to shed their economic ties to Iran, through many ring fences of safety around that. So I have thought a lot about this particular question and come to the conclusion that the preeminence of the dollar and therefore the underlying ability of the United States to use these powerful sanctions, including as a unilateral matter, will not be sabotaged by overuse, but rather, if that happens, instead by mismanagement or poor stewardship of the dollar. So if we see a real crisis of confidence in the Fed system or the ability of the United States to manage its financial system as a general matter, that will be the reason why sanctions cease to really have efficacy. But at that point, that particular problem for the United States is amongst the least of its problems as a broader economic and strategic matter.
Ben, would you like to?
I don't have any better answer than what she just said. I think that's right. My only addition would be for those that are not academically inclined on the dollar or not living and breathing sanctions every day. I know we have a very large audience. Fareed Zakaria had a piece in the Washington Post just a few days ago that explains some of these issues in more layman's terms. So to the extent that you want more information, I agree with Liz that there's a chance that we can overuse sanctions. And I think as a policy matter, It's an easy thing for U.S. policymakers to do because, unlike other actions, it doesn't risk a lot of U.S. assets. It doesn't risk U.S. military, and so it's an easy thing to point to that they're taking hard action on policy items. I think sometimes it can be overused, and particularly when it is done in a way that harms the local people, the local economies, without really getting at the leadership of particular places. But overall, if the dollar is strong in these conditions, I think we're a long ways away from it being overused right now.
I mean, one problem for China is that it's not willing to open up its capital account. And until it does that, it can never have a dominant global currency because by definition, you're not allowing your currency to circulate around the world. So China has to do that. But, of course, the top policymakers like, well, this will cause instability, et cetera, et cetera. It will cause a period of instability. But after that, then you'll have renminbi all over the world and you've sort of overcome this hump, if you will. Now it's a great opportunity to do it because the US interest rates are really low and Chinese interest rates are higher. But because Xi Jinping has put so much emphasis on stability, I don't think the technocrats sort of dare to do that.
Right, I see. Very good. So one last question I have for the panel before I move on to the Q&A, although I sort of already cover some of the questions from the audience. Now, how do you foresee the US strategy will evolve, given that both Russia and China are accelerating their de-dollarization process? Do you see the United States might become even more aggressive in the years to come in order to, advance its foreign policy before it is too late, before the dollar loses dominance? Or do you think the US will take a more restrained approach so that it will avoid its dollar position being weakened as a result?
I mean, just to be clear about what I was saying before, the people who have entertained the anxiety that the United States may lose its dollar preeminence and therefore its ability to engage in sanctions the way it has before. I don't see officials, financial officials, sort of Fed officials or US Treasury officials being particularly worried by that concern at the moment. And so they see no need to hold back on their strategy. So there is that. And I think something Ben was getting at was that there are other kinds of damage that heavy use of sanctions can create, which are not in the realm of undermining the strength of the dollar, but rather in undermining US credibility and its trust with, shared trust and relationship with allies who don't appreciate what the United States is doing to otherwise sabotage their common cause or common strategy. So first amongst those are Europeans who, and the Germans in particular, who have been the subject of an awful lot of US criticism and sanctions threats, secondary sanctions threats, and have made no secret of their displeasure with this situation. So that's a different kind of fallout, which actually I think if we are coming at this as a strategic matter or trying to contemplate where the policy will go, that is much more of a motivating or guiding factor for a potential Biden administration in how it would therefore shape its sanctions policy or its use of sanctions instruments in the future, much more so than the anxiety or analysis some people have about overuse of sanctions degrading the underlying strength of the tool. So if we are coming at this from a political perspective, we should stay very focused on that issue. And there's another, not just that credibility and trust issue, but also people bring this up as sort of a even transactional national security concern with regard to China. So if the United States is trying to conduct its foreign policy and thinking about how to use these tools and not overdo the image of itself that Chinese leaders have used to paint the United States as a hostile actor, acting counter to their interests. So the United States doesn't need to hurt its own interests by overdoing an aggressive posture on sanctions if there are other ways to go about it. That's another way that sanctions policymakers might consider the way they want to shape their policy or the use of the tool going forward.
Although on the other hand, I would say China does not have to be overly worried about, it's not like if Biden became president, suddenly Japan, Korea, all of Europe will ally with the US and have like a unified bloc against China. That's just not going to happen. I mean, Germany, for example, some, country that I know a little bit about, has very different economic interests vis-a-vis China than the United States. I mean, the car industry, politically very powerful in Germany, is 100% invested in China and still is. They cannot, you saw the CEO of VW said, well, Xinjiang, I've never heard of what's happening in Xinjiang. I have no idea. He actually said that. I mean, a German with its history and all actually said he did not know about concentration camps in Xinjiang. That really speaks volume, to the extent to which German corporate leaders are not willing to join in any economic sanctions against China.
Right. Okay, so now let's move on to the Q&A. We do have received a lot of questions. Some of them are very detailed. It seems like the audience is quite concerned about the potential sanctions on Hong Kong banks and individuals. Now, let me start with something very, very concrete from Bob. To what depth level do you see U.S. sanctions being extended when the lists are released later this year or next year? Could it go as far as sanctioning small two-person hedge funds in Hong Kong?
I think probably not. I think I've done a lot of risk analysis for various companies who are trying to look forward on what the U.S. administration might do. And I think the focus probably is on officials who are either responsible for implementing and enforcing the national security law, who are involved in somehow undermining the civil liberties that are enshrined in the basic law, or for the secondary sanctions, who are making transactions brazenly with those that are already sanctioned. So I think that those are the main concerns. There's lots of different ways in which you can do a risk assessment if you have a particular concern about a politically exposed person, or if the actions of a particular fund or entity may give you some heartburn. So it's not far off from a diligence process if they were involved in the suppression of protests last year, or if they were somehow involved with government acts, and there can be concerns raised. But I don't think it will, for every single entity in Hong Kong. One of the things that we have to remember is that these are not comprehensive sanctions. So the sanctions that are on Iran or North Korea or Cuba, those don't exist in Hong Kong or in China, at least not yet. And I think the likelihood of that happening is still relatively low.
Right. Here I have a question specifically directed for Elizabeth. It's from Frank Hong from the Cook Ding Institute. It's a very good name for an institute. Obviously, the U.S. sanctions against Hong Kong takes place against the backdrop of a barrage of sanctions against Chinese entities and individuals in recent months. Do you see the United States impose sanctions too many and too frequent at its own peril? Is it wise for the United States to use sanctions as we see in the recent months? I think we touched upon this before.
I mean, this is awfully subjective. So is it wise? It depends entirely upon what objectives we see or we would ascribe to the U.S. administration. Is it to its own peril? That also is based on a subjective judgment about what we think the costs are that the U.S. administration thinks are worthy of taking in order to advance its policy agenda. None of these tools, sanctions, export controls, are costless. They all come with costs. And that's part of the enterprise. And theoretically, for the US administration to go down this path, it has judged that the value is greater than the cost. I would also offer the view, the question, I can't remember the exact way you phrased it before, but the actions that have been taken toward China in recent months, they are mostly not sanctions. They are mostly entity listings, for example, commerce entity listings, or BIS, commerce's BIS entity listings, and other actions. We've got restrictions on imports, the bulk power rule. We've got, there's a whole host of other proposed restrictions on capital market activity. So I think if we stepped back a bit from those specific questions and just asked it in the form of, is the United States achieving on its objectives, and is it doing itself greater harm than good, or some amount of undue harm and unnecessary harm? I think the answer to that is the chaos of these various apparently uncoordinated actions has some fallout for the United States, and particularly in diminishing or undermining U.S. economic competitiveness, particularly in some high-tech domains such as semiconductors or other sophisticated technology areas. And that of itself that's really concerning. The fallout from that I find much more concerning than the particular financial fallout from these sanctions. So it's worthy to have this conversation about the financial sector effects, or for the banking industry effects of these Hong Kong-based sanctions. But I actually think that if we're trying to look at this from a whole, we should not get distracted from what is going on for U.S. economic, the diminishment to U.S. economic and tech competitiveness of many of these other aggressive and relatively uncoordinated actions in the export control domain.
Right, I see. And here's a question that relates to Chinese countermeasures, and then I wonder whether Victor can take that question or other panelists, because in Victor's during Victor's interview, we talk about how China could potentially retaliate using some financial measures, but here is an audience was raising more of like a trade and market access question. So the audience was asking, the U.S. exports $120 billion worth of goods to China and imports $539 billion worth of goods, meaning that overall China is the U.S. biggest trading partner. Are these enormous bilateral trade not a deterrent to the United States using the nuclear option on the Chinese financial institutions? What would lead Sino-American trade to plummet? Which could potentially lead the Sino-US trade to plummet and maybe crash the American economy. And of course, on top of that, I mean, in addition to the audience question, I mean, China also have huge market access, that could potentially be used as leverage. So I wonder, what do you think about that?
So yeah, I mean, that's, so they break it down to export and import, right? So the China hardly bought anything from the US for the first 5 months of this year. It was a lot lower than the levels seen last year. And, because China was going through its own economic, downturn and so on and so forth, it didn't make things significantly worse than they already were in the US. The US, of course, just like the rest of the world, suffered and is still in the middle of an economic downturn. So that already happened, right? So if you want to know what it looks like when China doesn't buy anything from the US, this happened already for the first 6 months of the year. I mean, things have turned the corner a little bit. I think for June and July, China bought more from the US in accordance to the first phase trade agreement. For the first 5 months, very little. So we already saw it. It was bad, it wasn't good, but it wasn't disastrous, more than it already was a disaster already, right, for the US economy. Of course, China is a main supplier of PPE and also a lot of pharmaceuticals, and China can just stop exporting that to the US But all that will do is that some clever Korean or German is going to buy up massive amount of PPE and then resell it to the US at a slightly higher markup. And China so far does not have the ability to globally, sanction people for doing that, nor would exporters in China want that, right? So exporters in China, if they can't sell to the US, which is for some of these manufacturers, the largest market for them, they're going to take a huge financial hit. So as the trade war escalated, a lot of these Chinese economists, they did think about that possibility. It's like, well, we just won't sell to the US all this stuff. But then what they figure out was that that's really stupid, because that really hurts the Chinese economy. As your questioner pointed out, China exports so much more to the US than the US is exporting to China. So any export restrictions from China will hurt the Chinese economy more.
Right. Okay, so this is kind of a very difficult question. It's from P.Y. Low. This is a question that has been bothering me a long time. Regarding Hong Kong's struggle for a revival of democracy, would you say that treating Hong Kong as part of China in relations, including suspension or termination of the Fulbright program, imposing sanctions on certain persons and statements of solidarity with the Hong Kong people will maintain the momentum of the agents of change in Hong Kong, particularly when the immediate victim is Hong Kong?
I can give my 2 cents on this, that it's nothing more than my own opinion. The protesters last year, they wanted these actions from the United States government. They asked for decertification under the Hong Kong laws, and they asked for sanctions against certain individuals. Last year, living through the protests of Hong Kong in here, and had a lot of concerns about that, because there is a certain irony of protesters demanding additional autonomy for Hong Kong to then demand that the United States treat Hong Kong like China. And so I do worry that in the long term, these actions could accelerate the lack of Hong Kong's autonomy and the closure of the one country, two systems. But I also think it's incredibly volatile right now between the United States, China, and Hong Kong. We are, to say these are in unprecedented times has just become a cliche, but we are seeing a huge change. The United States has irrevocably changed its relationship with China that'll go beyond any particular elected official, and maybe some good can come of that, in that I think it was time for the United States to reassess its strategic engagement with China. But my hope is that as things get normalized a bit in the coming months, that there will be ways in which Hong Kong continues its unique place in history and in the world, and while at the same time maintaining its relationship with the United States and with China.
Right. Now here's another question for Liz. Thanks, Liz, for highlighting Hong Kong being a big financial center that the United States might treat China and Hong Kong differently. Now, the list only have 11%. How big do you predict the list can get? I mean, do you have any educated guess? I mean, I guess we talked a little bit about that before.
So it's a little hard to know what kind of it's hard to know what kind of list the State Department will put together mid next month, because this is not an administration that has functioned like the way the last couple of administrations have functioned when it comes to sanctions on so many levels. The State Department is much more prominently involved in the crafting and implementation of sanctions. They have a stronger role on messaging. There's a different relationship and involvement at the level of the president in a lot of these different sanctions. I think it would make sense if for this administration, I think and it could be likely that the list, the first list would be those 11 individuals that were already sanctioned, or might stray a little bit further from there. It's possible that there could be some derivative designations, which is to say people who are closely financially connected or have a otherwise a particular alliance. We could see, I mean, is there some small expansion there? I don't think it's likely that we'll see a really different methodological approach going on here, something more like the oligarch list, which was, you could see this kind of tossing up of the hands amongst the people who were creating the list and deciding that it was a very problematic exercise. So they were going to import the Forbes list of, a wealthy individual, Russian individuals, or, it's different than that. I don't think we'll go in that kind of direction, but we don't know what it'll look like. And this administration is awfully unpredictable. So it's hard to say where that will go. I think some of the more interesting prospects for designations, though, could be if the United States wants to be, if the administration wants to be sort of aggressive and brush further forward on the Hong Kong sanctions, instead of pouring their energy into a robust, expanded list of individuals, what they might do is just name additional targets under their executive authorities here, including derivative sanctions targets for financial holdings or companies or other entities which act for or on behalf of these designated individuals. So that's a different approach to the way sanctions could be imposed, and it might get around some of the structure of that Congress has superimposed on the administration, but nevertheless give this administration an ability to take steps with regard to Hong Kong. So Ben might have another view on where that will go, but I guess I would just encourage people not to get too hung up on the idea that the list, the State Department list, will be the be-all and end-all. And just to be provocative, because we're coming to the end of our time, I will just point out that I was thinking earlier today about the scenario where, that State Department list comes in mid-October. The Treasury list, of the financial institutions linked to them comes between, I think, 30 and 60 days later, even though the sanctions don't have to be imposed, for a year. But what that means is that could come, if Biden is elected, in the lame duck period for President Trump, who might be feeling particularly annoyed and frustrated and has a bone to pick with China or Hong Kong, and create the opportunity for some awfully aggressive actions as sort of, the grenade you throw as you're walking out the door. So not to be alarmist, but I was just trying to contemplate earlier today what the political overlay could be on this, which is a different kind of consideration. But right, Victor and Ben, you should opine on that too.
Because in the interest of time, because we only have 1 minute left, and I really want to get this opportunity to ask one last question, and this question is directed to Victor because it relates to countermeasures. We talked a lot about Chinese countermeasure earlier, and there is one audience from Doreen Tan who raised a question about any thoughts about the touted Chinese unreliable entity list as a countermeasure. And as you know, last year China's Ministry of Commerce announced it would start a Chinese unreliable entity list as a program, although there's no specific entity that has been released yet. But there's a lot of rumors going around. So what does Victor think about that?
Yeah, no, so obviously, Boeing, even without the political reason, probably belongs to that list because its product is not very reliable. So, that's one candidate. You have Microsoft potentially. So I think you have variation. I mean, I think Boeing is very obvious and obviously would harm Boeing, especially at a time when no one is buying jets anyway. So that will hurt that company. But having said that, and I go to Seattle a lot, even in the city of Seattle, Boeing is no longer even that dominant in that city. That has been replaced by Amazon, obviously the sort of economic behemoth in Seattle, followed by Microsoft, followed by Google, followed by Facebook. So economically in the US, just manufactured hardware is no longer that important for its economy. So even if Boeing were to take a hit, and of course, China stopped buying all Boeing jets, into the future, will be a very significant hit to Boeing, obviously. But for the US economy as a whole, it will be kind of a glitch. Farm goods is more serious, especially for the farm states. But the problem for China is that China fundamentally needs to import a lot of food. If it doesn't buy from the US, it has to buy from Australia and Brazil. But the US, as a potential countermeasure against what China is doing to US farmers, can maybe pressure those countries to sell less, maybe, not sell at all to China, but to sell less, or put a cap on how much they're exporting to China. And that will create a lot of problems in China just because China needs to import a lot of food. It imported 100 million tons of grain last year.
Right, so either way, it's difficult. Okay, I saw that we are already 2 minutes over our time, and I'm really grateful to all our participants who joined us today, and especially to our guest speakers who joined us from 3 different time zones. Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Victor. Okay, I hope that you can come and join us more in our activities at the China Law Center in the future, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.